Claude responded. That morning, I opened the folder my late wife kept every insurance paper in for 31 years, and I found it empty. That morning, I opened the folder my late wife kept every insurance paper in for 31 years, and I found it empty. My daughter called an hour later and said, "Dad, the wedding's in 3 days. I had you declared incompetent, moved the deed into my name, and sold the lake house to cover the venue." She said, "You'll thank me eventually." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I said 4 words, "Send me the invitation," and I made 1 phone call. By the time her guests sat down for the reception, she understood exactly what her father used to do for a living. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight, neighbor. I want to know who's sitting with me for this one. Let me walk you through how this whole nightmare started. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of morning in the Blue Ridge foothills where the fog sits low over the ridge line until about 9, and the air smells like wood smoke even before anyone's lit a fire. My name is Walter Kessling. I'm 68 years old. For 34 years, I worked as a claims fraud investigator for one of the largest property and casualty insurers in the country, the man they called in when a fire looked a little too convenient, when a stolen boat turned up registered under a cousin's name in Florida, when a wealthy man's warehouse burned down 4 months after he canceled his contents policy. I built a career on the simple, unglamorous truth that people lie about money more than they lie about anything else in their lives, including who they love. I was sitting at my kitchen table that morning with a mug of coffee going cold beside me, sorting through a filing box because I'd promised myself I'd finally get my late wife Carol's paperwork organized. Carol passed 18 months ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late, gone too fast. The house had been quiet since then, in a way that furniture and a television left on can't fix. I still made 2 cups of coffee some mornings out of habit before I caught myself. The folder I was looking for held the paperwork for a modest whole-life policy Carol had taken out on herself back when our daughter Renee was a baby, plus the deed and title documents for a small cabin on Lake James that Carol's mother had left us. That cabin wasn't worth some enormous fortune, maybe $310,000 on the current market, but it was the one place Carol and I had gone every summer for 26 years. It was where Renee learned to swim. It was where I taught her to bait a hook and she pretended to be disgusted and then cried when I threw the fish back. Carol's ashes are scattered along the tree line behind that cabin. That land was not an asset to me. It was the last place my wife's laughter still lived. The folder was empty. Not misplaced. Empty, with the hanging file itself still labeled in Carol's handwriting. Before I could even process that, my cell phone rang. It was Renee. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not make this difficult," she said, before I'd even said hello. I asked her what she meant. "The wedding's in 3 days," she said. "You know venues like the one Tanner and I booked don't come cheap, and honestly, Dad, you weren't using that cabin anyway. I had Dr. Whitfield sign off on a competency evaluation last month. You've been forgetting things, you know that. You left the stove on twice this summer, and I used the power of attorney to transfer the cabin deed into my name. It's already sold. Closed Friday. I took the equity, and Mom's policy paid out to me directly since I was listed as contingent beneficiary after Mom updated it years ago. I know this is a lot, but you'll thank me eventually. You always say family is everything." I sat there with the phone against my ear, and I said absolutely nothing for 11 full seconds. I counted them, because counting things has always been how I keep my hands from shaking when my chest wants to catch fire. "You had me declared incompetent," I said finally. "Not a question. A confirmation. For the record, the way I used to confirm a suspect's statement before I let them keep talking. It's just a formality, Dad. Dr. Whitfield said it happens all the time with aging parents. It protects everyone. Aging parents. I am 68 years old. I ran 6 miles on the treadmill in my basement 2 days before that phone call. Renee," I said, "send me the invitation. I'd like to come." There was a pause on her end, a pause that told me she'd expected shouting, expected tears, expected the confused, defeated old man Dr. Whitfield had apparently signed off on. Instead, she got silence, and silence unsettles people who are used to being the loudest voice in the room. "You're not upset?" she asked. "I'm processing," I told her, which was true in a way she couldn't possibly understand yet. Send the invitation, sweetheart. I'll be there. I hung up the phone and I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, not shaking, not raging, thinking about the fact that a man does not spend 3.5 decades reading the small print on other people's fraud without eventually reading his own life the same way. Because here is what my daughter did not know, sitting in her fiancé's rented townhouse 3 hours away in Charlotte, congratulating herself on a plan she thought was clever. 5 years ago, when Carol's diagnosis came back stage 3, I sat down with an estate attorney named Harold Pruitt, a man I'd worked alongside for a decade when the company needed outside counsel on complex fraud litigation, and I restructured everything. Not out of suspicion of Renee back then. I loved my daughter without a single reservation, but because I had spent my entire professional life watching what happens to families when money and grief collide with no safeguards in place. I had seen sons contest their mother's wills before the funeral flowers wilted. I had seen brothers stop speaking over a fishing boat. I built protections into our estate the way I'd build a fraud case, assuming the worst possible actor, and closing every door before they knew it existed. The cabin deed Renee transferred was not the actual deed. It was a certified copy held in a document management file that Harold's office maintained for exactly this kind of contingency, a copy that looked, to any county clerk unfamiliar with the original recording, sufficiently official, because I had, years earlier, had Harold record a duplicate parcel filing as part of a legitimate but obscure land trust restructuring that never fully closed. The real deed sat inside an irrevocable trust that Carol and I established together, one that required 2 trustee signatures, mine and Harold's, to transfer or sell. Renee did not know the trust existed because Carol and I made the deliberate decision, back when Renee was newly engaged to a man neither of us fully trusted, not to tell her. And the life insurance policy? The one Renee claimed had paid out to her directly as contingent beneficiary. That detail almost made me laugh out loud at my kitchen table, alone, for the first time in 18 months. Carol updated that beneficiary designation 4 months before she died, not to add Renee as contingent, but to remove her entirely and replace the designation with the Walter Kessling Memorial Literacy Fund, a small nonprofit we'd quietly built together to fund reading programs in 3 rural elementary schools. The same schools Carol had substitute taught in for a decade before she got sick. Renee did not know that either, because Carol asked me not to tell her until she was ready to have that conversation herself. She never got the chance. Cancer took that conversation away from both of us. So when Renee said she'd used the power of attorney and the policy paid out to her, she had, in fact, committed insurance fraud and real property fraud against a trust and a nonprofit fund she didn't know existed, using a forged competency evaluation from a doctor I intended to have a very serious conversation with. I finished my coffee. Then I called Harold Pruitt. "Harold," I said when he picked up, "I need you to pull every file connected to the Kessling Land Trust and the Literacy Fund beneficiary designation. And I need you to tell me everything you can find out about a Dr. Whitfield, who apparently signed a competency evaluation on me last month without ever examining me. Harold, God bless him, is 71 years old and has been retired from active litigation for 4 years. But the moment I said, forged competency evaluation, I heard him set down whatever he was holding. "Walter," he said slowly, "tell me you're not talking about Renee." "I'm talking about Renee," I said. "And I need everything by Thursday. The wedding's Saturday." "You're going to the wedding?" "She invited me," I said. "Well, she's about to." Over the next 2 days, Harold and I built the kind of case file I used to build for a living, except this time the fraudulent claimant shared my late wife's chin and my mother's stubbornness. Harold pulled the notary log from the county recorder's office and found that the power of attorney document Renee submitted had been notarized at a UPS store 40 minutes from her townhouse, not by any attorney's office, not by a hospital notary, but by a temp employee named Kayla who, it turned out, had notarized 11 documents that same week for a wedding planning company called Ever After Events, the same company Renee had hired. Harold made 2 phone calls and learned that Ever After Events had, on at least 3 prior occasions over the past 2 years, been connected loosely through a shared office suite to a man named Tanner Voss. Tanner Voss, my future son-in-law, the man Renee was marrying in 4 days. I want to be careful here, Because I do not make accusations I cannot support with documents. That habit is baked so deep into my bones I doubt it will ever leave me, even in a nursing home someday. But Harold found something that made the hair on my arms stand up. 18 months ago, before Carol had even passed, Tanner Voss had opened an LLC called Ridgeline Event Consulting. Ridgeline's registered agent was the same attorney who had, 4 weeks prior, filed the fraudulent deed transfer for the lake cabin with the county clerk. And Ridgeline Event Consulting's only listed client, in its entire 18-month existence, was Ever After Events, the wedding planning company that employed the notary who forged my signature. Tanner Voss had built a shell company, specifically, to receive and launder the proceeds of my cabin sale before the wedding even happened. He had done this while Carol was still alive. He had done this while sitting across my dinner table, eating pot roast and calling me Pop, and asking my advice about which ring cut Renee would like better. I did not tell Renee any of this. Not yet. A man who spent 34 years catching liars knows the value of letting a liar keep talking. The moment you reveal what you know, they stop making mistakes. I needed Tanner Voss to keep believing he was $300,000 and one wedding away from a clean getaway. Thursday afternoon, I drove to Dr. Whitfield's office. Not the real doctor. Whitfield, my longtime physician, a good man named Dr. Aaron Chen, who had treated me for 11 years, but the Dr. Whitfield, whose signature appeared on the competency evaluation. It took one phone call to the state medical licensing board to learn that no physician named Whitfield was licensed to practice in the state of North Carolina. The signature was a fabrication. There was no doctor. There had never been a doctor. Renee had told me, over the phone, with total confidence, about an examination that never occurred, performed by a man who did not exist. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a medical building that had nothing to do with any of this, and for the first time since that phone call, I let myself feel the full weight of what my daughter had done. Not the money I could survive losing the cabin, painful as it would be. It was the audacity of inventing a doctor, of deciding, calmly and with total premeditation, that the easiest obstacle standing between her and a cheaper wedding budget was her own father's competence, his dignity, his standing as a man capable of managing his own affairs. Family isn't supposed to require a fraud investigation, but I had one anyway, and I was going to finish it properly. Friday, Harold and I filed an emergency motion with the county court to freeze any further disbursement from the trust and to place an immediate lien on the sale proceeds of the cabin on the grounds of fraudulent conveyance and forged power of attorney. Because the trust required 2 trustee signatures that were never obtained, the sale itself was voidable, meaning the buyer, an unsuspecting young couple relocating from Ohio who had no idea any of this was happening, was at risk of having their new lake house purchase unwound entirely. I felt for them. I made sure Harold's motion specifically protected their deposit and gave them priority to either complete a legitimate purchase once the fraud was resolved or receive a full refund with interest from the actual wrongdoers. Innocent people should never pay for another man's greed. That much I insisted on. We also sent a formal notice to the underwriters' fraud unit, my old colleagues, several of whom I'd trained personally over 3 decades, flagging the insurance policy disbursement as fraudulently obtained. That triggers an automatic 90-day hold on any funds already dispersed, along with a mandatory referral to the State Insurance Fraud Bureau, once forgery is confirmed. Renee did not know that a fraudulently obtained life insurance payout doesn't just get quietly returned. It becomes a felony matter the moment a claims examiner confirms the beneficiary designation was falsified. By Friday night, everything was in motion. The cabin sale was frozen. The insurance payout was flagged. The forged competency evaluation was documented as fabricated by a licensing board search, and Tanner Voss's shell company had a paper trail leading directly back to the same notary who forged my signature, a trail Harold quietly shared, off the record, with a detective in the county financial crimes unit who owed me a favor from a fraud case we'd worked together 9 years earlier. And still, I said nothing to Renee. I called her Friday night, and I asked her what time the ceremony started Saturday, and whether I should wear the navy suit or the charcoal one. She told me the navy because it was softer, and she sounded relieved, genuinely relieved, that her father was simply going to show up and smile and hand over $300,000 of grief and silence without a fight. Saturday came clear and bright, one of those late September days in the foothills where the sky goes an almost impossible blue and the maples are just beginning to turn at the edges. The wedding was held at a converted barn venue outside Morganton. String lights hung across exposed timber beams, 200 guests in folding chairs draped in white fabric, a five-piece band tuning up near a stone fireplace at the far end. It was, I will admit, a beautiful setting. My daughter had good taste. She had simply financed that taste with fraud. I arrived 40 minutes early, in the Navy suit, and I greeted people I hadn't seen in years. Carol's sister from Asheville, my old neighbor Jean, who'd driven 2 hours to be there, Renee's college roommate who hugged me and told me how sorry she still was about Carol. I smiled. I meant the smiles. None of this was those people's fault. Tanner found me near the drink table around noon, clapped me on the shoulder with the easy confidence of a man who believes he's already won. "Pop, glad you could make it," he said. "Renee said you took the cabin news like a champ." "I took it like a father who's had some time to think," I told him, and I watched something flicker behind his eyes, not fear yet, just the faintest recalibration, the way a man's face changes when a sentence doesn't land quite the way he expected. The ceremony began at 1 o'clock. I sat in the second row, beside Carol's sister, and I watched my daughter walk down a sawdust aisle in her mother's altered wedding dress. Carol had asked for that, specifically, in the last months, that Renee wear it altered rather than buy something new, and Renee had honored that request. And for one unguarded moment I felt my throat close up, watching her walk toward a man who had helped orchestrate a fraud against her own father, while planning to marry her in her dead mother's dress. The officiant, a friend of Tanner's from college, got through the opening remarks. He reached the part about if anyone here has reason why these two should not be joined, the old ceremonial line most officiants skip entirely now, but this one, for whatever reason, still included as tradition. He said it almost as a joke, glancing up with a small smile, expecting silence. I stood up. The barn went quiet in the particular way. 200 people go quiet when something has clearly gone wrong, but no one yet understands what. Renee turned, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands, her face draining of color at the sight of her father standing in the second row in a Navy suit. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying in the silence, "what are you doing?" "I have a wedding gift," I said, and I nodded toward the back of the barn, where 2 unmarked county sedans had just pulled quietly into the gravel lot, exactly on the schedule Harold and I had arranged with the detective the night before. Not a dramatic raid with sirens and drawn weapons. This was a financial crimes matter, not a violent one, and I had specifically asked that it be handled with dignity, for Renee's sake if nothing else. 2 detectives in plain clothes walked up the aisle at an unhurried pace, and the taller one held up a folder. "Tanner Voss," he said. "We need to speak with you regarding Ridgeline Event Consulting and a fraudulent notarization filed with the county recorder's office." Tanner's face went the color of the tablecloths. He looked at Renee, and Renee looked at him, and I watched my daughter's entire understanding of the last 6 months collapse in real time across her face. The realization that the man she was marrying had built a shell company to launder her father's cabin money, before her mother had even died, and that he had let her believe the fraud was entirely her own idea, her own initiative, her own daughterly overreach, when in fact, he had been the architect standing quietly behind her the whole time. "There is also," the second detective said, turning to Renee with considerably more gentleness than I expected, "an active fraud referral involving a falsified physician's competency evaluation and an insurance beneficiary claim. We'll need to speak with you as well, ma'am, though given the circumstances, the district attorney's office has indicated they're prepared to discuss a cooperation agreement, given evidence suggesting you may not have understood the full scope of what you were involved in." That last part, the cooperation agreement, was something Harold had specifically negotiated with the DA's office 2 days earlier, based on evidence he'd compiled proving Tanner had solicited Renee into the scheme while concealing his own shell company and his own financial motive. I had made that call deliberately. I wanted justice. I did not want to destroy my daughter's entire future over a wedding she'd been talked into corrupting by a man who loved her deposit more than he loved her. The 200 guests sat frozen in their folding chairs, and Renee stood at the altar in her mother's dress, and Tanner Voss was led out through the barn doors, past the string lights he hadn't paid for honestly, and I stood in the aisle, an old man in a navy suit who had spent 3.5 decades learning exactly how to build a case and exactly when to let one go. I did not gloat. I want to be clear about that, for anyone watching who thinks I walked out of that barn feeling triumphant. I felt 68 years old and profoundly, permanently tired. Renee did not go to prison. The DA's office, exactly as Harold predicted, accepted a plea to a reduced charge given her cooperation in Tanner's prosecution, probation, restitution, and mandatory financial fraud counseling, along with a permanent record that will follow her, which I did not fight to remove, because actions require consequences even when we love the person who committed them. Tanner Voss was not so fortunate. The Financial Crimes Unit, once they pulled the full thread on Ridgeline Event Consulting, found 2 other victims, an elderly widower in Hickory and a divorced woman in Lenoir, both of whom had lost retirement funds to the same shell company pattern over the previous 3 years. Tanner is currently awaiting trial on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation, facing what Harold estimates will be somewhere between 8 and 14 years, depending on how the additional victims' cases resolve. The cabin was returned to the trust in full, the sale voided, and the young couple from Ohio, the ones who nearly lost their dream lake house to a fraud they knew nothing about, closed on a fully legitimate purchase 3 weeks later, at the exact price they'd originally agreed to, with the extra escrow costs covered quietly by me, because it wasn't their fault my family broke, and I wasn't going to let 2 strangers pay for it. The Literacy Fund received its full $412,000 once the fraud referral cleared the insurance company's investigation, more than the original policy amount. Actually, because of the interest accrued during the 90-day hold and a penalty payment, the insurer was contractually obligated to pay for the delayed and fraudulently redirected disbursement. Next spring, the Walter Kessling Memorial Literacy Fund will open a full-time reading center in the same elementary school where Carol used to substitute teach, something we had only ever talked about as a distant dream while she was alive. Renee and I do not speak often now. Some wounds season with time into something softer. Others just scar over and stay tender to the touch, no matter how many years pass. She sent me a letter 4 months ago, no phone call. A letter, the old-fashioned kind with a stamp apologizing, not for the wedding, but for believing, even for a moment, that her father's mind and dignity were negotiable line items in someone else's budget. I wrote her back. I told her I loved her. I told her the door was open, but that it would open slowly, the way trust always rebuilds, one honest year at a time rather than one dramatic gesture. I still drive up to the cabin most weekends now that it's back where it belongs. I sit on the same dock where Carol used to read paperbacks in a folding chair, and some mornings the fog sits so low over the lake that the tree line where her ashes rest just about disappears into the white, and I sit there with my coffee and I think about the fact that a man can spend 34 years building a career on other people's lies and still, somehow, be shocked when the lie finally comes from someone who shares his blood. But I wasn't shocked for long, and I wasn't defeated, not even for that one long morning at the kitchen table. Because some men fall apart when the people they trust most turn out to be the ones who cost them everything. And some of us just quietly open the file, follow the paper trail exactly where it leads, and let the truth do what truth has always done best, in a courtroom or a church, in front of 200 witnesses or none at all. Family isn't the people who show up for the wedding. It's the people who'd still show up for you the morning after, when the money's gone and the folder's empty and there's nothing left to gain by staying. I found out this year exactly who those people were. And at 68, sitting on my late wife's dock with the fog burning slowly off the water, I can tell you plainly I have never once regretted knowing. Claude responded, "Real love doesn't ask you to hand over your dignity to prove it. Real love doesn't ask you to hand over your dignity to prove it. Sometimes the kindest thing a father can do is stay calm, follow the truth patiently, and let people face what they've done instead of shielding them from it. Forgiveness can still wait at the door, but it opens slowly, one honest year at a time. That's not coldness. That's what real love looks like when it's grown wise." A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its quiet lesson about honesty and love still warms your heart.